think about vision aligned to God's purpose, I think about surrender. I think about abiding in His Word and more of Him and less of me. I don't think one comes into their fullness and definitive way of what their vision is. I think we're constantly becoming and constantly evolving. And I think that's the beauty of life. Hi everyone, my name is Sentle Nell. So at the beginning of every year, I go on a consecration fast. It's one that is edifying for me, so not necessarily linked to social media, food, TV or my phone, but all inclusive of the things that I know I need to put aside and consecrate my spirit for in getting closer to God. It's a difficult period at times because you've just come out of December and the gluttony that comes with that. But part of it is also sacrificing your wants and your desires for a closer relationship with God. And every season, every year, He's proved Himself faithful in that time that I put aside to seek more of Him and less of me. So part of my vision in a year and starting off a year is kicking it off with a fast. So this year there are several things that I'm trusting Him for, and He's proved Himself faithful in other areas too that I wasn't necessarily keen on. But I also understand that the journey is liquid and fluid, and part of it is tapping into each other and praying through seasons of not necessarily yourself and waiting for a vision for yourself, but for others. And in that, I think we find value. So I honestly believe that the call for young people is not necessarily to stay in the traditional spectrum of what church is. This is very controversial, I imagine, for a lot of people, but to also reach out in other avenues that aren't necessarily cute or Christianesque. It's a call on us to go to certain areas that are unpopular or areas that are deemed to be uncool and speak the word and speak it boldly, even to the point of being sidelined or being labeled. I'm not saying take on the banner and put on the cross and walk in the streets, but I'm saying in your daily lives, in your interactions at work, at school, with friends, leave a bit of Jesus wherever you go. I work in a field where there's a lot of community engagement, where there's a lot of community interaction. As part of the projects that we run, I'm in the renewable energy sector. And part of that interface taps into my purpose, I suppose, in many ways, of being a facilitator, of being an orator, of being someone that has difficult discussions around economic growth for Black people. And it's a double-edged sword because you want development for people, but you also have to look at the business end game. But I think God uses us in our little nodes of, this is just me, and pushes you to seek more of Him in that, knowing that you can't do it by your own strength. And I think I'm coming to the point of realizing that it's one thing to want to manufacture your own miracles for whatever gain, and way easier to just surrender to His will and let things be. Not from a passive standpoint, but from a knowledge that all things will work together for good. I think the tenets and the fruits of the Spirit are clear. Are you kind? Are you patient? Are you understanding? What level of impact are you leaving the next person with? Is it edifying and living up the principles of godliness? And I think sometimes we get so jaded with traditional mechanisms of Christianity, and not necessarily understanding the context of people that may not know the gospel of Jesus Christ, or people that may not even be interested in that. But it's in your interactions of being kind, of being a person that has integrity, of being a person that's patient, but also willing to extend the hand. Not necessarily Bible bashing or quoting the scripture offhand, but I think the tenets and the fruits of the Spirit should be guidance of that. I mean, it's an age-old saying, pretty generic, but stay in your lane, humble yourself, and always be willing to learn. I think in that there's a level of grace that is set aside for that, in knowing that your path is just for you. Everyone else is taken, right? So in knowing that your path is just for you, and knowing that in humility, you're willing to learn. And I always marvel at people that are constantly, oh no, I've learned as much as I can, I refuse to learn. And I think we're constantly at a point of learning and unlearning, be it societal norms, be it religious norms, be it interactions, and the whole spectrum of society and what it stands for in this day and age. And I think for me, it's those three: humility, staying in your own lane, and constantly learning and evolving. Those three tenets continue to chart the way in discovering my purpose and becoming. So I think in any space, for me, the basic tenet is knowing that you're there to obviously impact a change, from even if you don't understand the context that you're in. Part of it is that element of humility and coming in and leaving a bit of Jesus in that standpoint. I find that sometimes I can be a bit introverted and sort of want to shy away from certain interactions or groups, especially when it comes to networking. But God will call you out, right? And in calling you out, you also have to put on a boldness that says, I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to speak to these individuals. So I work in an industry where we have interaction with various stakeholders from the public sector. So you have ministers, DGs, etc., but also multinationals that come into the fore, especially coming into the South African context. And you come in as this young black girl, and automatically the assumption is that black girl magic, put on show. And it's not necessarily the case, because sometimes you also need to step back and give yourself that credence to learn, to humble yourself, but also get nuggets of growth in that space, in being kind, in being generous, in being listening, but also showing Jesus in you. And that's the journey that I've been on, and it served me well. And I think part of it is also extending that olive branch to the next person. I currently work with a group of young women, and we have a space that's not necessarily confined or defined as empowerment, but that's what we do. So we share opportunities for board memberships, we share opportunities for mentorship opportunities within the church and outside of the church. And I think it's in that connect group where they extend the baiting themselves to others and so on and so forth. And I think that's the core for fellowship, really, in knowing the crux of who you are, but also sharing that gift. Relationships are paramount. We thrive with them, and we sometimes struggle without them. And I think sometimes there's this notion of thinking mentorship is something that's aloof, or what can I get? But I think it's Issa Rae, I always use this quote, Issa Rae, that said sometimes, especially young people, always want to network above. How can I get to an Oprah? How can I get to an Ellen DeGeneres? How can I get to a Felicia Mabuza? As opposed to networking across and people on your level that can assist you, but not necessarily monetarily or via influence, but from a growth perspective, and opening other networks in that. And mentorship for me also doesn't speak to careers only or relationship based only. It's also about someone's value system that you identify with, and you can also not necessarily replicate but learn from. So I don't necessarily see challenges as a threat. I think there's a lesson behind everything, and sometimes there is no lesson. But the key thing is to remain steadfast and agile in knowing whose you are, in knowing that God has set a certain path for you, and that stumbling block that you reach. I realize that perhaps I haven't aligned myself to a clear goal or to a clear purpose, or again, there's a lesson behind it. Was I too hasty? Did I try to manufacture my own things? Or did I go about it in the wrong way? And I think there's also a timing aspect to it. And I struggle with this, I'll admit it. I always think my time trumps God's time. It's the other way around. And what's vital in that, he's also teaching me patience. He's teaching me surrender. He's teaching me understanding that the world is bigger, but there's also a lesson in sanctification for my life for that. Do I get down in the dumps? Sure, sometimes. Do I have a cry about it? Absolutely. But I think it's also a lesson in humility. It's also a lesson in understanding that things aren't necessarily smooth sailing, but there's grace that's sufficient for that stumbling block. And in that, a lesson. Parting thoughts would be no perfect people allowed. There's no such thing as perfection in the body of Christ. But in that, every day is an opportunity to learn, to be Christ-like, to continue to become and not necessarily reach a certain destination. And in that, kindness to each other, understanding, compassion, empathy, and taking up your baton, whatever it is, be it school, be it relationships, be it work, be it traveling, whatever it is, and be the best at it to your ability. So I actually came across this when I was watching an interview between Lupita Nyong'o and Oprah Winfrey. It's a prayer of Jabez. And Jabez calls out to God and says, God, that you would enlarge my territory. But in enlarging my territory, prepare me for that abundance. Prepare me for life's journeys. Prepare me for life's stumbling blocks. and make that space in me and in my heart for that, regardless of what it is. And I thought about it for a while, and I remember reading the context in the word. And part of it was that the name Jabez in itself means strife, but overcoming strife. And I thought to myself, imagine your parents giving you a name like that, and your prayer as a son saying, Lord, that you would enlarge my territory, right? And I meditated for a while, and I think sometimes Christians always like to gravitate to prosperity, I receive this and that. But if you step back, are you ready for that? Are you prepared for the vision and the wishes and the prosperity and the growth for that? And I had to reevaluate my goals and my wants and my desires for 2020 and say, but God, even in my wanting, even in my desires, prepare me spiritually, mentally, physically for that. And I think that's one of the scriptures that speak to me, that is charting my path for this year and edifying me spiritually. Connect.